Chapter 23. Almost Normal. Joe awoke the next morning, stiff and sore, but otherwise in pretty good shape, physically and emotionally. With Shannon's guidance, Kimmy had been able to use her technique to heal Joe's worst wounds almost completely. While doing so, Shannon had explained to Joe and Sarah why she had kept from them just how aware she was of their situation. Her reasons had been about what Joe had expected, seeing Joe and the other dueling hearts, with their unique souls, as the best chance against the leader of the Soul Takers. She had worried that they would come to rely too much on her and her power if they knew how much she knew, and that doing so might cause them to rely less on their own abilities and actually put themselves in more danger. Sarah was annoyed with her, and once it was clear that Shannon was okay, she made that very well known. Joe wasn't particularly happy with the explanation either, but she at least understood it. After all, she had made what now, in retrospect, seemed like a foolish choice not to tell her mom about what was going on in order to keep her safe. Clearly stupid but well-meaning ideas were something that ran in the family. Still, as odd as it was hearing Shannon, of all people, talking about these things, hearing how much she actually knew did serve to put Joe at ease. What brought it back around to odd, though, was what Shannon said next, before Joe had gone off to bed, after Sarah had left the room. "I meant it, Joe. What I said back at the construction site, that you and your friends are the best chance we have." She had refused to look at Joe as she explained. "Their leader. He can do things that only others with the same divine-type soul can stand up to. I've spent so much time learning everything I can about Soul in the hopes that I could find a way to beat him myself, and I never succeeded." It was a startling revelation, and lying there in bed, Joe was genuinely surprised that she had slept so well despite it. She'd been too exhausted after her fight with Max to lie awake at all or even have any of her typical nightmares. It felt surprisingly good, and so she held on to that good mood with some stretches, loosening herself up enough that rising to her feet wasn't completely unbearable. She pulled on some of the least dirty clothing strewn across her floor, rubbing the tender spot on her abdomen where Max's knife had hit her. She could smell something cooking downstairs, drawing her attention, and then herself toward the kitchen, where she found Shannon frying a pan full of eggs over easy. Shannon smiled over at Joe. "Good morning. I heard you shuffling around up there, so I put some breakfast on for you." "Thanks," Joe replied, then hesitated, unsure of what else she would say. Here she was talking to someone she had known for literally her entire life, and she didn't know how to proceed. "You don't have to say anything," Shannon told Joe, well aware of how awkward things had become. "I know you don't quite know what to think about me at this point, and I don't expect things to go back to normal immediately." "It's not that," Joe protested. "It's not like I resent you or anything. In fact, I feel better about what I've been through knowing that you had my back for at least some of it. I'm a little disappointed that you somehow lost to Max, but I'll get over it." She laughed at her own joke, but Shannon didn't. Thankfully, Joe didn't notice. There were just some things that Shannon couldn't bring herself to talk about with her daughter, at least not yet, and the end of her fight with Max was one of them. She would work past it eventually. Understanding how desperate Max's situation had been was already helping with that, but eventually hadn't come yet. "I'm glad you see it that way," Shannon told Joe. "I just wish I could fight this fight for you. I honestly hope that, when it comes again, I'll be able to fight at least some part of it, to protect you from what I can. But until then, we have to try and live our lives. We can't let all of this change who we are." Joe laughed again, and Shannon looked away from the stove, asking, "What's so funny?" "Nothing," Joe replied. "It's just that I said something a lot like that recently." This time Shannon did laugh with her daughter, the two of them marveling at a rare moment of genuine similarity between them, and some of the tension disappeared. Things weren't quite normal between them yet, but they could see a point in the future where they would be again, and for now they were content with things being almost normal. Joe leaned back against the doorway between the hallway and the kitchen, waiting for the food to finish cooking, and she noticed the clock on the oven. "Wait," she said, "it's past noon?" "Yeah," Shannon told her. "After yesterday, I figured you should sleep in. I guess your internal clock agreed with me." Part of Joe was disappointed. There was something she had wanted to do this morning. Yet an equal part of her was all right with her mother letting her sleep. It seemed that, if nothing else, Joe and Shannon being open with each other regarding the situation with the Soul Takers meant that Joe wouldn't have to pretend to be fine after a difficult fight anymore. Still, Joe wanted to accomplish her task, but she was hesitant to tell Shannon about it, so she couldn't rush Shannon without raising suspicion. She struggled momentarily with how to handle the situation, and then she decided to just go for broke and tell Shannon what was going on with her, beyond the semi-regular threats to her life. After all, what had keeping secrets gotten either of them so far? She hesitated, trying to decide how to phrase what she wanted to say, and purely by chance, Shannon gave her the opening that she needed. "Before I forget, Karen called about an hour ago," Shannon announced. "She wanted to meet up with you at some point, maybe even today. She said that you would know why." "Do you have any problem with that?" Joe asked her. I mean, now that I know that you know that she used to be my enemy, I'm kind of curious. Shannon paused. It was clear that she did have a problem, at least somewhere deep down. But she replied, I wouldn't be allowing her to stay with my student if I didn't believe that her intentions were good. Even if they turn out not to be, I have no reason to tell you not to spend time with her. You've proven you're more than a match for her already. What do you think of her? Joe asked. Shannon seemed surprised by the question. Well, seeing her in my house before I knew that she was your ally really startled me. That left a bad impression. But I don't dislike her. She seems like a good kid at heart. Tough and confident, and very strong. I'm glad that we have her on our side. I'm just wondering, Joe said, because I sort of asked her out for after this thing with Max was sorted out. Which is now, I guess, though I don't even know if she still wants to, since I basically used her as bait to get Max to fight me. She paused, looking nervously at her mom, waiting to see how she would react. Shannon flipped the eggs one last time and moved them carefully from the frying pan to a pair of plates. After a moment or so of hesitation, she turned and handed one of those plates to Joe, saying, I won't tell you that I trust Karen completely, because I don't, but I know that people can change. I trust your instincts. If you like her and she likes you, then I think you should see where this goes. Relieved more than she expected she would be, Joe took the plate from Shannon, the two of them sat together at the kitchen table, and they talked. Shannon pressed Joe, and Joe told her all about the time that she and Karen had spent together over the last week. Shannon smiled and laughed and listened as Joe described in detail how strong Karen was, and how thinking about her made Joe feel. It felt like the kind of thing that any other mother and daughter might talk about, and it made Joe happy. When the two of them were finished eating, Joe gathered up her courage and called Kimmy's house. Kimmy herself answered, as chipper as always, and called for Karen when Joe asked her to. They chatted for a couple more minutes. Despite the events of the previous night, Kimmy was as easy to talk to as always. Joe realized that she was glad that the bubbly girl was going to be fighting this fight alongside her and the rest of the team. Even if Joe did sometimes find her constant positivity a little grating, it would be good to have that kind of perspective on hand. Finally, Karen arrived and Kimmy handed the phone off to her. Hello? She asked. Hi, Joe told her, unsure how Karen would react to hearing her voice. Hey, Karen replied. Joe couldn't read her tone well enough to tell whether she was happy to hear from Joe or not. I was wondering, Joe asked her, cutting right to the chase, if you wanted to meet at the mall. Maybe you walk around for a while and talk? Yeah, Karen replied. Sure. You want to meet up now? Works for me, Joe told her. We can meet at the food court, at the same table as last time. You'll probably get there first, this time of day. The two girls exchanged pleasantries. Joe got the sense that there was some awkwardness on Karen's end, too, which just made her more nervous. Joe still felt that she had done the right thing at the construction site, that there had been no other way to get Max to take her challenge other than to make the wager she had made. But she still wouldn't blame Karen if her actions had turned the other girl off to the idea of a relationship. Joe took a fast shower, grabbed her favorite old, faded black overshirt, and walked to the bus stop. She took the entire bus ride to the town center to brace herself. Despite her efforts, she knew that she would be crushed if things turned out how she worried they would. Less than an hour later, Joe arrived at the stop nearest to the mall. She could have shadow-stepped the rest of the way in a second, but instead she felt like taking her time. So she walked that distance at a normal pace, trying one last time to clear her mind. One way or another, it was always nice to talk to Karen. Today would be a good day in at least that one regard. Think positive, Joe thought. Pretend you're Kimmy. She chuckled and picked up her pace a little bit as she stepped onto the curb leading to the big main entrance to the mall complex. As soon as Joe stepped into the food court, she looked around for Karen. Even in the weekend crowd, her eyes found the other girl immediately. She was beautiful. Her hair pulled back into a ponytail, held up by an actual pink bow. She was wearing a light pink t-shirt under an orange and red flannel and skinny jeans. She had borrowed some makeup from Kimmy, using it sparingly, highlighting her eyes and choosing a shade of lipstick that matched the color of her shirt almost exactly. She looked like something out of an 80s movie, and it was awesome. Karen had taken Joe's words to heart, and was waiting next to the very same pair of tables that the Dueling Hearts had used for their recent meeting, leaning against the same pillar that Joe herself had been leaning against when Karen had kissed her. Forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to be worried, Joe practically skipped over to where Karen stood. She came to a stop a few feet away from the other girl and walked casually the rest of the way to her side. Hey, Karen told Joe with a smile. Only now did Joe see that Karen was holding something. Two somethings, in fact. I was going to get us some of the nachos you liked, but I wasn't sure if you'd eaten, Karen explained, so I got us some coffees instead. She handed over one of two white paper cups, and Joe sniffed the warm fumes rising through the slit in the lid. It was a mocha latte with extra espresso, Joe's drink of choice. She was surprised that Karen had remembered it. She'd only mentioned it to her once, offhand. Thanks, Joe told her. She wondered for half a second or so where Karen had gotten the money for the drinks, but she decided that she didn't care and took a sip. As she did, Karen stepped away from the pillar. Joe followed her, and soon the two of them were sitting at one of the tables, directly across from one another. They sat in silence for a couple minutes before Karen finally spoke. "How are you feeling after the heart-to-heart yesterday?" she asked. "You took even more of a beating than you did the last time we fought." "I'm fine," Joe replied simply, forcing a smile. "A little bit stiff in the places that Kimmy couldn't quite get to with her healing technique, but better than I usually am after a hard fight, so I can't complain." She paused, and then, much as she had with Shannon, she just sucked it up and asked, "How are you doing?" "What do you mean?" Karen asked. "I mean," Joe began, speaking carefully, "you've got to be upset, right? About what I did? I basically bet your life against my mom's. I figured that you'd want to talk about it. Karen looked confused. "I guess I would have liked a heads up first," she replied. "I was definitely surprised, but I don't think you made the wrong move or anything. If you'd mentioned your plan to us ahead of time, I would have agreed to let you try, just like I ended up doing anyway." "You mean you're not mad at me?" Joe asked her. "I'd prefer that you didn't do something like that again," Karen told her. "But I thought about it, and I understand why you did what you did. Your mom was in trouble. You were more concerned with acting than you were with talking. So no, I'm not. We're good. Just, if something like that happens again, talk to me. I'll listen to you, I promise." Joe felt like a literal weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Immediately, she was visibly more relaxed, and Karen could tell. She sat back in her chair. "I didn't realize that you were so worried. You don't have to be. I wouldn't have made the choice to ally with you in the first place if I didn't trust you. I want you to realize that." Joe nodded and asked, "So if we're okay, does that mean we're still on?" "For what?" Karen asked. "For our date," Joe told her, like it should be obvious. "We said that we would go on a date after the Reaper was dealt with, and I'd still like to do that." She waited for Karen to respond. Instead, Karen smiled at her sympathetically and looked very much like she was trying not to laugh. "Joe," Karen said finally, "I thought this was the date." Joe felt her face go red. She couldn't believe how clueless she'd been. If Karen wasn't upset with her, then of course she thought this was the date. It should have been obvious, and having missed it, Joe felt embarrassed. However, when she saw how amused Karen was, Joe couldn't help but laugh at her own mistake. Karen started laughing too, and all remaining tension between them melted away. Neither of them knew where to go from there, since neither of them had been on an actual date before, so they ended up sitting and talking for the next few hours. They discussed fight tactics a little, before moving on to probing each other for any of their shared interests. Joe revealed that her mom knew about her feelings now, so Karen didn't have to hide things, and Karen gushed about how far out of the way Kimmy had already gone to make her house feel like Karen's new home. Eventually, though, the conversation did fizzle out, so the two girls parted ways, committing to doing something similar again sometime soon. As she made her way back home, Joe couldn't remember ever being happier. Kimmy's house was in practically the opposite direction from Joe's, so as Joe rode away on one bus, Karen remained, standing at the other bus stop by the mall, waiting for another. It was still a few minutes away, but Karen didn't mind. Like Joe, she had enjoyed the afternoon, and she was still riding high from the experience. In fact, she was so content that she almost didn't notice when someone approached her from behind. "Karen done?" a male voice asked. He sounded sure of the answer, but also diplomatic, as if he didn't intend to push for the answer he wanted. Despite this, something about his tone sounded off, and immediately Karen switched modes, going on the defensive. "That depends on who wants to know," Karen announced, turning to face the speaker, scrutinizing him with both her standard and non-standard senses. She didn't sense any substantial amount of soul from him, nor did she get the impression that he was holding any power back, making it unlikely that he was here to fight. In terms of his appearance, he was stout, with a thick mustache, and wore a suit that was just a little too tight, enough for it to be noticeable. After a moment or so, Karen realized that she actually recognized this man. Before launching their original attack against Joe and her team, Karen, Monty, and Lawrence had observed their fight against another team, Team Beatdown. This man had refereed that match. "I represent a group," the man explained, "with substantial resources. We are aware of your recent departure from the ranks of the Soul Takers organization." "And who is we, exactly?" Karen asked. "Not important," the man replied, waving the question aside. "What is important is that, being aware of your situation, we are also aware that you might, let's say, be lacking in resources. Monetary resources, to be specific. We have no desire for you and your friends, Monty and Lawrence, to have to live uncomfortably. That's why I'm here. I want to offer you a job." "What kind of job?" Karen asked, honestly intrigued. "Simple," the man replied. "The thing is, we have a particular interest in Joe Seeker and her dueling hearts, in their powers and their abilities. We already have means of observing them publicly, but in order to form the most complete picture of what they can do, we would like for you to keep an eye on them in private as well, and report back to us any training methods that they might be employing at any given time, and what the philosophies behind those methods might be." I'm not going to hurt Joe, or any of the others, Karen insisted immediately. And we don't want you to, the stout man told her assuredly. We're simply interested in their methods of growing more powerful for purely academic research purposes. We simply care enough about obtaining this information that we don't want to risk asking for it directly and being told no. If you agree, you will be helping us and yourself, and hurting no one. You may even help the dueling hearts down the line, if our plans go well. It's a win-win situation all around. Karen didn't answer. She was trying to pin down this man's motives, but she couldn't, and she had to admit, at least to herself, that if he was telling the truth, then the offer was tempting, no matter how much money the man was offering her. She hesitated, processing what little information she had, but before she could finish, her bus pulled up to the curb behind her. The stout man looked over Karen's shoulder at the bus, and he smiled. Think about it, he told Karen, handing her a small rectangular card, and contact me with your answer. I promise you won't regret it. The stout man walked away without another word, carrying himself like someone who couldn't feel more confident if he tried. Karen looked down at the business card, at the 10-digit number typed out there in white on a simple black surface. She looked one more time at the man, contemplatively, and then turned and boarded the bus before it could leave her behind. A full month passed before anything else of note happened in the lives of the dueling hearts. During that time, Joe and Karen continued to see each other, though they did fall into a pattern of taking things slow, getting together most often at group events rather than alone. Today was one of those days. The dueling hearts, with the exception of Rocky, Kimmy, and Lawrence, had gathered at the Mega Dojo to watch the rare match at the installation that didn't involve any of them. It was a juniors match featuring M's former training partners. While M really got into it, calling for literal blood, the others paid the match very little attention. Instead, they talked, laughing together. Joe and Karen sat next to each other in chairs that were pushed so close together that they were touching. Occasionally, Karen would lean into Joe's shoulder. Sometimes she would even reach over and take Joe's hand into hers below the table. Not once did Joe know how to react, but she appreciated it. She hadn't quite moved on from the recent danger, but things felt almost normal, and in some ways they were even better than that. Then, out of nowhere, the happy gathering was interrupted. Joe was surprised to find herself overcome by a mysterious chill. The others must have been as well, because their conversation ceased all at once. Only M didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care, probably because she didn't recognize the sensation. Joe had only just reached out cautiously with her senses when she perceived a form standing at her side. She knew, even before looking, that it was Max. When she did look up at him, she saw that he was still wearing the same hoodie, though it looked recently washed and patched, much like her own black overshirt, and she could still see his face below its raised hood. He was watching the match on the main fighting stage with passing interest, but when he spoke it was clear that he was speaking directly to Joe. Don't expect me to be around too much, he told her, his voice cracking slightly. I haven't been close with anyone in years, and I don't plan to change that now, but I will be around when you need me. Without another word, the former soul-taker was gone again, Smoke stepping away before Joe could say a word. It was good to know that Max had taken the dueling hearts up on their offer, that he might be moving on from the horrors of his past. That, more immediately, he would be there to help in the coming fight, but Joe had to work to feel happy about any of it. After a minute or so, the group started to feel comfortable again, resuming their conversation, but Max's return had served as a powerful reminder to Joe, and to the others as well, of something that they had been trying to forget, that no matter how hard they tried and how long they waited, things wouldn't be more than almost normal ever again.